Hello and welcome to a very special edition, actually, of our little webinar series that we've been doing for the RTPI CPD. I'm here today with Tim Crawshaw, who is also our forthcoming RTPI president. So we're very excited to have him on board. This is actually, as I said, an additional side event from a webinar that we had 2 months ago, where Tim was actually forecast to go on, and unfortunately due to some circumstances wasn't able to join us. So we're really excited that today we get to have this little additional time with Tim. And as chair of the RTPI Southwest, I'm really pleased to have Tim on board with us, and he's going to give us a lovely chat now about what he does and the great things that are around urban design. So I would very much like to hand over to Tim now and get the ball rolling, and then we'll have a little discussion afterwards, and very much look forward to hearing it, Tim. Thank you very much.
Lovely, thank you, Angharad. Okay, well, I was going to say, firstly, Southwest, thanks for having me. My name's Timothy Crawshaw. As you say, you'll know that I'm the incoming president next year for the Institute. I'm an urban designer, chartered town planner, and architecture is my first training. And I'm going to talk to you today about trying to integrate health and well-being into good design and place making. So I'm going to share my screen in a second. This should be here we are. That should be, hopefully you'll be able to see that very soon. So, title of the presentation: Delivery Mechanisms for Social Infrastructure, Healthcare and Local Services. And the one thing I would say is local services are really, really important. It's not just because of their local services that are there and it's more sustainable, because if you could walk or cycle to them, that you'd be making less journeys, and all the other sustainable development arguments that mean that local services and social infrastructure on your doorstep, indeed alongside green infrastructure, are a good thing. It's also because actually you're creating effectively a central place where people can meet, socialise. Even if they don't know each other, you do get that recognition of people who go to town, for example, on a Tuesday morning, like my mum used to, and every Tuesday morning she would go to town. She knew where the bus was going to stop. She would go to the shops. She had a routine of the shops she would go to. And she would effectively bump into people that she was either close to, because she'd been doing it for the last 20, nearly 30 years, or the be people that would be almost like acquaintances, but it was all part of her sort of wellness web, I guess, which was this, this trip to town. When they changed the buses, the decline was almost instant, that the confusion started to set in, the confidence to know where to get off and where to start. And the cracks began to form. And at the moment, I think that's a very relevant story, because I think with the restrictions we've been living through, older people, for lots of reasons, haven't been going out as much. And I know from friends of mine who've got ageing and elderly parents now that actually this has been a huge knock to their confidence and independence. And confidence and independence are at the heart of everybody staying well. And I think those local services and those central places are going to become even more important if we're going to try and maintain people's long-term independence. Next slide is here. So a lot of us, when we're creating places and indeed marketing places, designing places and everything else, broadly speaking, you will hear it, we're creating a village, and you will get master planned garden villages, which I will talk about later. But if you think about that village feeling, you'll have that village that's the village that's part of a city. Bristol, for example, is a series of villages, they say. Is that within these villages there is a certain set of kind of physical infrastructure and social infrastructure which make the place function really well. And obviously it's much easier to be able to sell property if it's near, for example, a village hall or a pub down the road. I'm a massive fan of village halls, because nothing good ever happened kind of without one. And you see that extended as far as being like a local wedding venue, or post funerals, or yoga, for example. So, or you kind of want to join a group where you want to lose a bit of weight, or your book club, or your film club, or whatever. If you have a village hall, I'm in a band, that's a perfect venue actually. on an evening to go and rehearse, for example. So it's a multifunctional space, which actually is there in places that are established, and we go, isn't that great? I want to live there. But actually in new places, who's going to build that then? And I will talk about that a little bit as we go through. And again, the other picture I've got here is the village green, sports facilities, green infrastructure. You know, these are not things that are just exclusively, you know, countryside things. And actually, I live quite close to the countryside, and I've lived in the deep countryside before, and sometimes that's not very accessible anyway. It looks like you could, but actually, you know, the access and public footpaths aren't that brilliant anyway. And sometimes you're actually much more able in town to be able to access green infrastructure because of the public rights of way network, which do converge often on your town, and people have been using those for a long time. So there's something here about the power of that village image that I want to try and touch on a little bit today. But a little bit more about me, I suppose, as we move on. I was involved in the NHS England Healthy New Towns programme and developed a series of design principles when I was working with Darlington. And you can read more about it. There's a document there with the web link at the bottom that really tries to express this complex web of characteristics of a place that will keep you well ultimately. And it's all stuff as planners we would totally recognise. Transport and movement, green infrastructure, healthy food choices, placemaking, economy, social infrastructure. And the reason why it's drawn like this is because I want to try and represent it as being a web. So it's okay, but often, you know, you get transport dominated master plans, for example, and I see that all the time. And actually, it's a significantly important issue. But if that hierarchy is wrong right from the start, you're going to be really, really struggling when it comes to trying to deliver the rest of it in terms of, you know, some basic stuff like a walkable neighbourhood. And that relates very, very closely to things like the green infrastructure. How do you get about the quality of that route? Can you play on the way? And you know, being quite demanding about green infrastructure actually means that you're not creating 5 facilities, you're actually creating one that does lots of stuff, and that's multifunctionality. And I will try and touch on in this the importance of that social infrastructure, which I'm going to talk about in a second, needs to be directly related to green infrastructure, particularly with things like social prescribing happening, and a much more flexible view about this kind of wellness picture, that actually the social infrastructure, maybe your village hall and everything else, if that's then associated with your green infrastructure, going back to my village analogy, what you're creating is a series of opportunities for people to socialise, for people to have social engagement, but also engagement with nature and everything else. And clearly, you know, flexible space that's maybe associated with the school, that's for wellness and health, is maybe not a leap too far, and again, a much more efficient use of public resources if there's going to be a hand in this from the public sector. I want to talk to you about the placemaking one. I would ask you to read the document and have a look at these in a bit more detail, because some of it's quite subtle, and some of it on the face of it you think, well, that's obvious, but actually when you look around, do you get it? Or if you're not getting it, why are we not getting it? And sometimes it's actually around asking for it in very, very precise terms. And also, you know, putting some sort of standard to it. So, for example, we're going to talk about a legible and permeable environment that's easily understood, and that's clear signage and wayfinding. So that's a really important principle in its own right. Now, we all talk about that, but actually, you know, when it comes down to it, you know, signage is actually quite important. I know there's this whole thing about, well, if you've got a sign, you've failed almost, you know. Actually, clearly people knowing where they're going and being confident about that. That confidence that even says public footpath means that you will go down there and you will go and explore. I think it's really important as well, we think about the role of existing buildings, landmarks, views. All those things are things that seat a new development into the landscape and into the context that it's working with. But also in terms of actually master planning an existing settlement, those landmarks, for example, like the bank, it's really confusing for people if that then changes to being a Wetherspoons. And all of a sudden the kind of the wayfinding and the legibility and the way the place actually works and functions starts to be undermined. Not that I'm anti-Wetherspoons in any way whatsoever, but what I'm saying is these changes of buildings that have, for example, in the hierarchy, a very public feel and a very hierarchical importance, it's quite important that they are almost retained as community facilities in a more sort of civic or, that kind of function almost. Natural surveillance and lack of clutter. I'll show you some terrible pictures of what happens when you get clutter on the street. And actually, this becomes a real barrier to people getting around independently, much in the same way that not having ramps. And I've worked in different contexts, different countries, where it's not a given, actually, that there's ramps on the street for people with disabilities to get around in wheelchairs. And you ask the question and say, why are there no disabled people? The thing is, there is. It's just they're not visible because they're not on the street. And I think then we're going to think about this thing about density of development must support good access to shops and services within a 5 to 10 minutes walk. So people talk about the 20-minute neighbourhood. I'm talking about turning this up to 11. This is about the 5 to 10 minutes walk. Not for everything, but I think it's an absolute tragedy when you have to get in the car to go and get a pint of milk. And actually the shop that you go to should sell something more than Carlsberg Special Brew and Battenberg. So I think it's really important that we think about that. I think intrinsic to all this as well is actually there needs to be enough places to kind of sit down, to take a rest, to be able to, actually be confident to be able to go out. And I think another thing that was on the news this morning, I think it's really important as well, that public toilet facilities are so important for absolutely everybody. Again, some fantastic stuff in there. Haven't invented the wheel. A lot of stuff you would find reference from other guidance from Sport England, for example, Town and Country Planning Association, and indeed the RTPI's Dementia Friendly Environment Planning document, which is awesome. So these landmarks are really important. This has got a lot more value than in its own right as a historic artifact. It says this is the middle of town. People are hanging out on it, and so they should. But I've actually seen that there's actually, I've been involved in planning discussions and negotiations with other parts of the council, where, for example, people sitting about's not seen as being a good thing. In fact, it's an antisocial behaviour attractor. And some of this stuff isn't universally liked. So you are sometimes fighting an uphill struggle, particularly if people have already negotiated with other parts of your organisation and actually the views come back that, the chair of the planning committee doesn't like local shops because kids hang around outside them. None of this is very helpful. But this landmark in itself is a really important example, for example, of something that says about the history of the place. It says something about the fact that people have been coming here for a long time. And it's also a point of gathering. And in simple terms, I'll meet you at the monument seems like a perfectly reasonable thing. Here, this is some of the outcomes, isn't it? We don't get the car parking right. How are you supposed to use that pavement if you are struggling with, any form of mobility problems and any kind of spatial perceptions, everything else, let alone the fact you probably just couldn't get through in a wheelchair. So broadly speaking, this on pavement parking is actually a consequence really of clearly too many cars, but also the fact that the car parking is, broadly speaking, now becoming a problem to the extent that it's now impeding people from getting around and stopping, the free use of that street. And the street really should be for people. So there is a question about how do we manage all this stuff, and I'll try and touch on it because there are some retrofitting sort of ideas that we need to think about in terms of our existing places, as much as obviously we spend a lot of time as planners thinking about new places. I still think there's a big sort of yawning gap in terms of what do we do with existing places. And then finally, the example I used here, this is, the bank, but it's not the bank, it's the pub. And that's very, very confusing. And I do think that actually these buildings have a much greater hierarchical importance in the urban environment. We should perhaps think about some of these as being the targets for community ownership, for them being something which you would actually relate to, maybe in a slightly different way to a night out. In terms of how we bring development forward, and I think this is kind of an example, and oh look, what a surprise. Urban designer comes along with an example from Finland, because urban designers always do that. It almost needs to have a klaxon that goes off like on, the telly where you say something really obvious. But the problem is it keeps going back around. There's a very different relationship we have here to effectively the creation of a new suburb in town on the edge of the city. So this is Kalastama. It's got a load of innovation within it actually around trying to bring forward innovation in terms of healthcare, wearables, health monitoring, but actually at the centre of it is also a much healthier attitude to things like green infrastructure, or indeed blue infrastructure. So who'd have thought next to your regeneration site, you're not going to see this very often, there's already been laid on a little barge with changing room and everything else, and somewhere to go and jump in what I assume is pretty cold water. Whereas obviously where I am, the river's about 3 feet deep and there's a big sign up saying don't go in here, you will die. So there is a very different relationship to green infrastructure and to the blue infrastructure, and also people's sort of healthy lifestyles that are sort of played out through those edges, which I think is now becoming more popular as a concept, that more and more people are going to find outdoor swimming opportunities, because yes, okay, there are risks attached to it, just in the same way as there's riding a bicycle, but actually the benefits of doing these things are probably greater than the sort of disbenefits, although I'm not recommending anybody does anything that might be damaging to their safety or whatever. The other key thing about this is, though, that's really interesting, and you can't see from here, is from the get-go, public transport infrastructure was put in, even before there's loads of buildings, yeah? So even before the developments happened, it's already been thought of, and that's not actually the way things often happen, isn't it? You're often chasing the initiative, trying to get some money to run a bus service for a few years, if you're lucky, and obviously it's a series of cul-de-sacs. How's the bus going to get in and get out anyway? This is a very different approach to creating new places with the appropriate transport infrastructure from the start. And you might go, well, that's just a city. You can do that in Helsinki, can't you? You can't do it anywhere else. Now, this is certainly not a criticism of the next place I'm going to show you, but very famously, this is Barking Riverside, where for an awful long time, there wasn't really any meaningful public transport. In fact, there weren't any shops. A very different way of doing things. And the problem is, this isn't really a criticism of any one particular place. What I'm saying is, my criticism is that if you allow the market and the market only, or other forces, to define how you get your infrastructure, you're in quite a lot of bother, really. And actually, there is a question here, and it's a big question because lots of people struggle with this. If you're creating a new place, how do you attract in those local services that mean people will get in the habit of walking to stuff rather than getting in a car and going somewhere else? And I think those early residents often come off really badly. And again, not the bad behaviours, I don't want to sound judgmental, but the less healthy travel choices become embedded because actually you can't get anything. Now, there is some innovation happening out there. The concept of actually bringing the public sector in has been the sort of source of slower money and investment at the heart of new development that might then bring social housing, that might then bring social infrastructure, that might then bring a range of other services working with the health service. So these things are established early and upfront. And obviously, the advantage, I guess, of public sector investment is it can take a longer view about that. It's not the in and out of the private sector needs to get in, build, and make the profit in the model that we understand. So that's a slightly different way of doing things. So there are some pockets of really good examples. This is one near me. This is West Park, which kind of happened with the initiative of an enlightened landowner. And that's sometimes just the very thing you need, is an enlightened landowner. So this local centre here was built very, very early doors. So was the school, even before there was a load of residents to use it. And, think about it, it's more than just a few sheds next to a car park. It's got some scale, it's got a sense of place. There's offices above the shops. And, shaky start, you get some vacancies, you get this, you get that, you get all the things where people look at it and go, oh, that'll never work. But actually, it's now settling in and we're getting a very steady stream of businesses coming in. Fantastic cafe, absolutely awesome. Where else can you get beautiful Belgian beer in this town? Well, this is the place you would do that. If you want to go for a more standard offer, there is the pub with the car park, undoubtedly. But run right through the whole thing is a sense of place that was established really early on. A poet was involved. It took the stories of the place, the wider context, and then created something that was memorable from the point, right from the start, so the very earliest residents felt they had somewhere that was theirs, and all that stuff was in right from the start. And this is key, not later on in the process, once effectively all those other forces have taken over and you're in the car for everything. The massive challenge, you know, and I've certainly got my eyes open to this. There are real problems. Where I'm up in the north, we're looking at, you know, 16% vacancy rates, getting worse in existing shopping areas. Clearly, we're going to have a different view about this. I want to basically highlight a couple of things here. Firstly, there's some really good guidance out there. If you look at the Local Government Association, that is a really, really interesting guide for anybody who's working in the public sector about what mechanisms that you could, you know, possibly use. I think the main underlining one I'd say with that is the vision thing. I think it's really important that the planners are involved in this. I've just certainly been involved in a master plan for Workstop, which is actually around reimagining. Much of the stuff's there already and still will be in the future. It's not all about new stuff. It's actually about repurposing the stuff that's actually there. Whereas in this example here, you can see that it wouldn't be a massive leap for some of these to, even if it was temporarily, you know, done right, could actually go back to being housing. Maybe it didn't start as housing, maybe it did. But you see lots of places actually that are on, for example, very popular walking routes where people have effectively opened a bakery in the front room. You know, so it's not all decline. And I think we've got to have a flexible way of both designing new stuff, but also having some flexibility in terms of the actual creative reuse of buildings. And you'll see this again, if you go to the Netherlands, you know, you'll see a shop, there'll be a house, there'll be a shop, there'll be a house. It doesn't have to be in many ways just a straight you know, connected high street for it to function and work. You might end up with different pockets and quarters, and certainly I see that in a lot of towns that have, you know, really the snapshot in time, and you can still see house, shop, post office, pub, and actually that feel perhaps isn't something to be afraid of as long as the quality's there. And as long as there's enough flexibility in the future for the town to breathe in and breathe out. And the high street, for example, to be able to function and actually create conditions where change can happen. So, you know, I think there's a lot of good guidance out there, but the key thing I'd underline from my point of view, I think it's really important, that confident vision thing about saying that this isn't the end, this is the beginning, I think is a really important message for any town that's reimagining itself. Give you an example here as well. This is nothing to do with, you know, public sector management in any way, this is where a traders association gets together and actually begins to revision their place, and people will start to be attracted to that revisioning. I'm part of a business and tourism association, and we're all about talking the town up. That is a key part of it, as well as also putting on events and you know, lots of other things. In wherever you live, actually, I'm really quite keen on this concept that I'm bringing in my spare time, actually, as a social activist, my role as a planner, into the sphere. And also there's people here who care passionately about their street, who have become part of the change and part of the revisioning, and who'd have thought, you know, just outside the town. But the key principle being just outside the city walls with this example is that this is the community hub for a lot of people. And the more you can build that picture, the more that this high street will be used more and more for day-to-day needs. And I think that's a really important concept that you're actually establishing places. So bring more things if you possibly can find a way of doing it, even if it's meantime uses, even if it's the cycle hub. You know, there's a range of things you can do where effectively a unit could be taken over by the public sector as well, you know, to be able to bring a different vibe or feel to a part of town that needs, you know, some TLC and regeneration. I'll just leave you with this thought, really. This is, as I say, from Blue Peter, you know, one I made earlier. This is getting slightly revised at the moment. This was consulted on earlier in the year, which is a new settlement, 4,000 homes. I haven't drawn every house, but what I'd like to highlight is that actually this has all been designed to around 5 to 10 minutes walk. It's been around having hubs that have education, hubs that are around transport. Green infrastructure connects those two hubs. It's worked with the local routes and paths. It's retained the landscape character. So actually this hopefully will become the beginnings and the framework of basically a new place, but designed from the ground up, where effectively it's 5 to 10 minutes walk. Nobody is further than that from some form of life, a focus, a centre, somewhere where you could even just take a walk. And we all love to see other humans on the street. So that's my presentation. If you want to contact me, there's my email address, and I will close my presentation and hopefully we can have a bit of discussion.
Thank you ever so much, Tim. I think that was absolutely brilliant, and personally I think it ticked every box on what I think is so important as being planners. As you'll know, my massive passion is to try and get health and well-being as a much raised higher profile out there. I think as planners we've got more ability to shape things than we actually do, and I think that your presentation just nailed that for me, and to have you here saying that in my year as chair is fantastic. So thank you very much for the hard work you're doing. If we can promote more of that, then I think we'll all be in a much better place. Just a few queries I thought we could just discuss, actually, a few questions that I had and I thought might help others who are watching. It was really interesting, and one of the main things I picked up on was the emphasis on bringing things in early and how important it is that we think about these things before we actually go ahead with the biggest part of a proposed development, aka the buildings. I mean, in terms of planning going forwards, and possibly something that you will be addressing in your year as president, how do you think we go about inspiring change on this matter? Because I mean, for years now as planners, we know that developers come along and they have to have the funding from Section 106s to get the infrastructure in. Do you have any ideas on how we could start changing that, so we could start looking at getting infrastructure in early to start planning these things around the building? What's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. And for me, I mean, there are some green shoots of this sort of thing happening. So the involvement of the public sector, I think, early doors. But to make an investment, it isn't all about cost. This is actually that if you build something that's successful and becomes the heart of a community that starts to get used to using it, there is profit in that. It just takes a lot longer. And and I have sympathy for developers who are probably have some of the same frustrations, because kind of what their model isn't that almost, and mixed use developments are actually not what house builders do almost. But by having other partnerships that might involve housing providers, it might involve social housing providers, it might involve step-down care, it might involve, involving health services and the NHS, and that these different bodies can actually work together and start to create the conditions also where private investment can happen in the future, by having things like flexible ground floors, and by ensuring that connectivity is there in the early stages. And simple things like a good plan will mean that the bus route would be attractive to come through. In fact, you're just making it easy, aren't you? Why would you drive a bus down a road with no houses on it or no activity when you could actually have one that goes past something? So it is just about good planning and design. But as you will know, I have a personal mission against cul-de-sacs, because broadly speaking, buses don't go down them, and people don't connect down them either. So if you end up with developments that aren't connected, that's a big thing. So for me, I think that we should be seeing a lot more, and I do hope to see that some of the green shoots that I was certainly aware of from the Healthy New Towns programme was that beginnings of that thinking, where actually I think there's an investment to be made that's for the commonwealth of everybody. And you know what? There's probably money in it too. So I think that's where it needs to be thought about. And why shouldn't the public sector be involved in some of those things early doors if there is a gap in the market? Just to start with, maybe.
Yeah. No, fantastic. Yeah, and I think there's a lot more to be done in improving relationships with other stakeholders. As you quite rightly said, it's bringing it all together, isn't it? It's not just about fixing one part of planning, it's about getting everybody together. So fantastic to know you're on board with that. I look forward to seeing how things can progress with that. I mean, in terms of other sort of things that we're looking at as planners, I mean, obviously the government's got its own agenda in terms of giving us more permitted development rights, for example, on retail areas, etc. what's your concerns around that aspect? I mean, in terms of residential permitted development rights and the impact it might have on the loss of these community builds that you've just so given such a great talk about, and the importance of them. How do we retain them?
Absolutely. So, without making any comment about where policy is going, it seems to me that there are some really key buildings that really do need to stay as public, civic, important, hierarchical. They're often your statutory protected ones too. So I do think we need to have a nuanced approach about, the sort of hit list almost. If there is an investment to be made, and you can get that investment through the public sector, that's where it kind of needs to be, because that's the place that people recognise. I mean, I've certainly got that in my town, there's a couple of banks around, and people go, this can't just go to, the market in that sense. So I do think that there's an opportunity, I think, and I think there's quite a lot of, leverage I think communities have now around community assets, which do help that. I don't think it's all doom and gloom. I think for me, it's all about flexibility and quality. What you don't want to have is a really, really degraded street scene where, the simplest solutions taken to kind of, well, how are we going to put housing in this, and you do see that. I mean, I've seen some really, really horrific examples of that, that involves UPVC and all sorts of things, oh no, so I think in some ways, I think towns are resilient. They've been there for an awful long time. I'm less concerned about some of the stuff in between the sort of landmarks and the hierarchically important buildings, because I think they've changed over time anyway. And I think for what it's worth, it might sound a bit ideological, but I've kind of got faith in town. It won't just die from the middle outwards. I do think that central place has got a lot going for it. And if there's a rebalancing at the moment, I think for me, and I suppose I touched on it in what I was saying, it's the vision thing. You want to attract the right investments into your town. And actually there is peer pressure about that. And I do think if people see really good, funky stuff happening, they kind of want to do really good, funky stuff. They don't want to do awful stuff. And I do think it becomes almost a bit shameful if you get your vision right. So I think there's a bit of that peer pressure thing. I think we need to be a bit more, civic pride and all those things. I'm not saying that's all on everybody. It's a much commonly shared belief in the place, I think, is what you try and get to. Try and do that. So no simple answer, but I've got a lot of hope.
Yeah, no, I'm with you on it. I'm with you on it all the way. I'd like to think that we can retain it and grow it and make it a place where people have these important interactions, which kind of touches upon the next point I just wanted to sort of finish with, and that is about mixed-use environments and the reason that, for me anyway, personally, I think they're a great aspect of planning, because it allows for this interaction of different people, different times of day, and the interactions. And from what you were saying in your presentation, am I right in thinking that you'd agree with that, and that they're quite an important space?
Totally. I think the not 24-hour, but I do think a wide range of activities throughout the day is absolutely essential to this. Yeah. Many towns, and I've visited and worked in a lot. I've travelled the UK, as well as the international stuff. The last thing you want is a town that dies at 5 o'clock, and then the tumbleweed blows past and nobody wants to be there. And actually, if you've got people living in town, that doesn't happen. You go to cities where people do live in the middle, like Edinburgh, and it's not just because it's Edinburgh, it's because it's like people live in the middle. It's really funky. It's a different approach to living in the city. Now, the next thing is, how do we make cities livable? And I do think, that there are really good examples. I mean, the difficulty, and I've tried this in an urban centre, bringing up children, and actually, just where's the play area, And actually, there's no reason why town centres should not be fun and playful. Yeah. And there's no reason why children shouldn't be seen, but you don't see them, And I think so I do think that we need to revision. Making towns livable is the thing that will be the attractor. That people will go, I want to live in town because it's dead convenient, and not oh dear, where am I going to park my car? It's becoming a bit of a badge of honour not to have one. I've got my young are certainly moving in that direction. It's like, well, I don't need a car, you know. I live a really good life because I don't need one. And you know what? I'm starting to feel that, you know. In the times I do use it, I'm thinking, I'm sat in the traffic jam thinking, this is mad. You know, because, you know, there's people walking past quicker than the traffic jam, you know.
Yeah.
So that's when you get the antagonism towards cyclists, because they are doing the right thing, and that's why people sat in cars like, oh,
yeah, quite frustrating.
So it's like, you know, so there is. I think I've got a lot of hope. I think we need to ride that hope around culture shift. Around there's a generation of folks that aren't necessarily going to behave in the way that the trajectory looks like. It's the old paradigm shift thing. So I'm very hopeful with town.
No, brilliant. Me too. Yeah, no, I think we've got a great ambition and vision together, I think, along with many others who are watching and many others who are in our professions. And I think together, as I've always said since day one of becoming chair, together we can make a difference, and it's just making sure that's followed through and everybody can do what they can do to make it a better place. So I'm conscious of time, and I know unfortunately we have come to the end of this session now, but can I just say a huge thank you. I think your presentation was, as I said, fantastic. I hope others who are watching have enjoyed it just as much as I have, and may I wish on behalf of all of the Southwest, you know, great wishes for next year, your incoming presidency, and I really hope we stay in touch and can work together to achieve better things. So thank you so much for coming, and yeah, fantastic. And thank you all for coming and watching. And our next webinar will be up soon, so please do join us for some more talking on active travel and some more passions on inclusive environments as well. So thank you all very much appreciated. Bye now.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye, Tim.
Bye.